Thank you, Deputy Speaker. It's such a pleasure to follow the honourable member for Beckenham, and I am genuinely hoping that your naughty finger won't be pointing towards me at any point in my remarks. We on these benches will not be opposing this bill because it's a step in the right direction. It is good to see the government finally recognising the need to put national security at the heart of the way in which we deal with foreign investment. However, the bill fails to address the broader issue of how takeovers and acquisitions should be regulated to promote our broader national and economic interest, and indeed the interests of British workers and their families across the length and breadth of our country. In this sense, it draws a false distinction between national security and economic security, because it's absolutely clear that the two are intrinsically linked. Madam Deputy Speaker, in order to properly reflect on the effectiveness of this legislation, we therefore need to go back to first principles. And we need to ask ourselves the single basic question: what is the economy actually for? Because it is only by reaching consensus on this fundamental point that we shall be in a position to assess the extent to which this bill will make a positive contribution to the lives and livelihoods of our constituents. Madam Deputy Speaker, the British economy is unbalanced, it is unstable, and is therefore profoundly lacking in resilience. It is too reliant on the financial services sector at the expense of manufacturing. Our manufacturing sector has collapsed since the 1970s, from 30% of GDP to just 9% now. It is too London-centric, thus failing to harness the talents of so many people from other areas of our country. It's too inward-looking, with persistent trade deficits. It is too unequal, pushing the proceeds of growth to the wealthiest 1%. And it is too short-sighted, constantly aiming for the fast buck rather than long-term and sustainable prosperity driven by patient capital. Every piece of legislation that is brought forward by the Department for Business, Energy and Industrial Strategy should be relentlessly focused on fixing these faulty foundations of our economy, these fundamental weaknesses. And every step that the Business Secretary takes should be a step towards an active industrial strategy that is designed to drive a modern manufacturing renaissance. He should be focused on homegrown industry and homegrown investment and homegrown technology. These critical steps will help to build that sense of purpose and resilience into the UK economy that we are so desperately missing. Madam Deputy Speaker, the culture of the UK's corporations is also in urgent need of change. The prevailing business strategies are driven by short-termism, with the delivery of fast buck profits to shareholders taking precedence over all other considerations. Addressing this will require a new deal between shareholders, companies and their workforces, and between the public and private sectors. Far too many of the corporations listed in the FTSE 500 are characterised by a transactional, rootless form of ownership, which militates against the investment in R&D, innovation, skills development and new technology, plant and machinery that is so desperately needed if we're to put our economy onto a more balanced and sustainable footing. The government's laissez-faire approach makes a major contribution to this short-termist culture because it opens the door to acquisitions by foreign companies, resulting in the UK having by far the highest number of successful hostile takeover bids of any advanced economy in the world. Time after time since 2010, we've seen our strategic national assets being flogged off to the highest bidder. Just look at the case of ARM, a jewel in the crown of the British tech industry, which is in the process of being sold to Nvidia. Or Cadbury's, an iconic British brand, sold to Kraft without any proper consideration of what this would mean for the long-term sustainability of the business. And moreover, our sovereign capability is profoundly undermined by the fact that much of our critical infrastructure is not in our own hands. In fact, 57 of our critical national infrastructure supply chains depend on China, from energy suppliers to our airports, to our pharmaceuticals, to our personal protective equipment. and the repercussions of this overexposure have been felt during the pandemic. Our lack of capacity to produce PPE has cost the UK taxpayer an eye-watering amount of money. A breaking story today, indeed, shows that a Spanish businessman has pocketed £21 million of British taxpayers' money because he simply was acting as a broker between the government and overseas suppliers, a potent symbol of systemic failure. Madam Deputy Speaker, let's be clear. Many of these so-called private takeovers and infrastructure investments are carried out by companies and investment vehicles which are a front for authoritarian state actors who have wider political and national security agendas and whose values are at odds with our commitment to democracy, to liberty, and to the rule of law. The crucial point here is that our values should not be for sale. The most obvious and pressing case, of course, is the Chinese government, which is relentlessly expanding its influence economically, politically, and militarily. We need only recall the recent case of Imagination Technologies, which was recently the target of a hostile takeover attempt by an investment vehicle with direct links to the Chinese state. And of course, there is substantial Chinese stakes in Hinkley Point and other sizable chunks of our critical national infrastructure. Successive Conservative governments since 2010 have been naive and complacent in their approach to China, exemplified, of course, by David Cameron and George Osborne's disastrous golden era strategy. It is time for this government, this House, and indeed the entire country, to wake up to the reality of these matters and to come to the realization that whilst we must always seek constructive engagement with China, we must take a clear-sighted, hard-headed approach to defending our national interest and our sovereign capability. Madam Deputy Speaker, I also wanted to take this opportunity to raise another more specific way in which the government's lethargic tendencies have proved costly to British business and weakened the economy as a result. The government has been naive about the deliberate attempts to weaken UK businesses through market distortion by the undermining of competition laws. The most obvious example of this is the deliberate overproduction of steel, way beyond global demand, and the subsequent illegal dumping of that steel on European markets. What has been the result of these illegal, uncompetitive practices combined with Conservative inertia? The weakening of UK steel companies and the opportunity for foreign investors, many of whom from countries which are the origin of that dumping in the first place, to buy up our strategically, nationally important assets. 80% of China's steel industry is state-owned. And the key point here is that the illegal dumping of products from those state-owned industries into European markets is an example of the practices that are undermining the international rules-based order. And that, in turn, has a damaging and direct impact on our industrial base and on our communities and their families, the workforces who are directly impacted by this. It is a perfect example of how the global is truly local. We need a level playing field, and what this legislation should be about, and what everything that the Bayes Department is about, should be about developing that level playing field so that our workforce is not competing with one hand tied behind its back, up against a system that is rigged against them from the word go. So, Madam Deputy Speaker, this bill is a big missed opportunity to strengthen the UK's wider industrial strategy and for the government to show that it is committed to building an economy of purpose and resilience. Moreover, it fails to reflect the impact of coronavirus on UK businesses and their increased vulnerability in the face of those vulture capitalists and state-backed actors which are waiting to pounce. This legislation only really seeks to protect the UK's national security and appears to do very little to support the UK's wider national interests, such as the need to protect jobs and support communities in this time of national emergency. But focusing on the all too narrow scope of the bill, I do also have genuine concerns about the process for arriving at a decision on whether or not to block a takeover. Currently, the plans are that this is a process which sits very firmly within BEIS. This is an issue. Firstly, because such a decision would have huge cross-departmental impact, that surely it would be better to create a multi-agency task force to rule on key decisions. Such a task force would include the Treasury, the Home Office, the Foreign Commonwealth and Development Office, the Intelligence and Security Services, and the Ministry of Defence. And it could follow a similar model to the Committee on Foreign Investment in the United States. All the signs were that BEIS was a cheerleader for the Huawei deal, when it was clearly against our national interest to go ahead with that deal. So this does not augur well for its ability to police the effective implementation of this bill. Secondly, handing all the decision-making power to the business secretary could lead to problems further down the line. Should a future incumbent, and I'm absolutely in no way implying that such a fate would befall the current business secretary, but should a future incumbent were to be influenced by political or commercial interests, whether in this country or from overseas. I will give her on that point.
I hadn't intended to intervene in the debate again, except to emphasise, perhaps to amplify the point he's just made. This legislation does bring us into line with other Five Eyes players, the intelligence community with which we work directly. But he's right in saying the mechanisms which they use are different in some cases to the ones employed in this bill, in exactly the way he described. So I wonder if the Minister will look at those mechanisms and to see what more we can learn from them as this bill goes through the House and is improved during its passage.
I thank the Right Honourable Member for his intervention. I think he's pointed to the fact that this is such a broad cross-departmental issue. It requires more than just one pair of eyes, if you'll excuse the pun, looking at this issue. Madam Deputy Speaker, time and again we've seen that the takeover regime is not fit for purpose. It is welcome that we're finally coming into line with other countries on national security, but we are still way behind on takeovers that would harm the national interest more broadly. Protecting our national security is only one element of protecting, nurturing and developing the vital sectors of the future that we know are crucial for our economy. Given the economic dislocation caused by coronavirus and potential corporate vulnerability, the case for action is stronger than ever. I will support this bill, but we need to see improvements and we need to see further regulation to protect British business and the broader national interest. Thank you.